can't leave. They're in the inner prison, and now they can't move, which means if there are prisoners that can move, they're vulnerable to the prisoners that can move because they're in stocks and can't go nowhere. Hopefully, everybody was in stocks. Hopefully. That'd be the good news. I hope. I haven't studied prison life in the first century of Europe. But about midnight, Paul and Silas, oh my gosh, but about midnight, at the darkest hour in the innermost place of prison, on the other side of taking a beating like they've never taken before, it says they were praying and singing hymns of praise to God. That is extraordinary worship. See, worship is not just about worshiping on a spiritual high when everything's right. Do you know how many people really get their worship on when they're in an arena and somebody's preaching and man, Israel or Fred Hammond just was singing and everybody's running and woo and worshiping, and then they go back to the hotel room that night and say, man, was God there? No. Can you worship at the midnight hour when your life is chained and locked up? When nobody understands you, when you feel beat down and discouraged and depressed, can you worship at midnight? Everybody can worship at 9 in the morning on a sunny day with a crisp, cool breeze, sitting on the porch in a rocking chair saying, isn't God good? But can you worship him when you get that note in the mail not knowing if you can still keep your house? When you've gone to doctor after doctor after doctor and you still don't know what's wrong, can you worship? When you already had surgery and the doctor tells you you have to have surgery again, can you worship? When you interviewed for the job and you didn't get it, and this is the 4th time in the last 5 months you didn't get the job, can you still worship? When you're praying that your wife would come back and she doesn't come back, when your husband leaves and you don't know why, when your kid runs away for the 4th time, when you thought you were going to graduate and you don't graduate, when you thought you were going to get married and the person you were engaged to says, I don't think this is going to work. Can you sing hymns? Can you praise him? Can you dance then? That's extraordinary worship. Worship that is extraordinary is the ability to worship in the storm. But this is what I want to tell you. You will never understand what it means to be a kingdom evangelist until you have learned how to worship in your own personal storm. Until you can worship in the midst of your own oppression, how can you go out into an oppressed world? Some people aren't ready to go on the mission field. Life's been too good. Sometimes brokenness is the best prerequisite for extending and proclaiming God's blessedness. Extraordinary worship. This is how you know when you're able to praise him, when there's no human, make sense reason to praise him. Paul met God outside the temple. Paul had the experience multiple times of praising God when it didn't make sense to. Acknowledging God's existence when you would think all the signs would say God was distant. But we have a mentor. We have a teacher. His name is Jesus. If Jesus, on the other side of saying, Father, why have you forsaken me? Even the Son of God had a moment where he says something that would cause you, if you stop there, to accuse Jesus of being agnostic. But on the other side of that, he puts his life in the Father's hand. On the other side of the statement of forsakenness, we see Jesus still trusting in his Father and in his own divinity. What about you? Can you worship him right now? Can you lift your hand when there's no song? Can you proclaim him when he didn't answer your prayer the way you wanted it to be answered? Can you worship him? Embracing extraordinary worship. This kind of worship takes maturity. I just got to tell you. You have to have a hunger and thirst for spiritual maturity to embrace this kind of life. But let me go to my last point. If you're willing to go beyond ordinary worship, if you're willing to embrace extraordinary worship, you are now prepared to engage culture. You are prepared to go into poverty, into disease, into brokenness, into division, into demonic forces swirling everywhere, and be salt and light, because your ministry is rooted in, your life of worship is rooted in your experience with God, your identity in God, and your ability to worship him even when things are not right in this world. That's what drives us back to Acts chapter 17. Paul was waiting for them in Athens on the other side of his personal experiences with God, on the other side of worshiping God in the midnight hour in stocks after being beaten in the innermost part of the prison. Now here is Paul in a pagan, secular, crazy world full of idols. Verse 17 said he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews, trying to convince other people to come out of the temple and walk into the culture. God-fearing Gentiles in the marketplace every day with those that had been present. Let me skip down to verse 22. Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus, the leaders of the community of Athens, and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by human hands." Let me back up. He said God is not the God of just the church. He's the God of the world. That's what he's saying. And if God is the God of the whole world and not just the church, then Paul is believing that God is present in the whole world and not just in the church. We need to stop acting as if God is only present and active and receivable in church. He is not the Lord of the church. He is the Lord of all. He's the Lord of all creation. Heaven, earth, and sky. That's who he is. You know the song. You are holy. Why is he holy? Not because he's just Lord of the church, because he's Lord of everything. Beyond our comprehension. Paul is worshiping at that depth. And he says, he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. And he made from one every nation of mankind, which means no matter where you live, no matter where you are, what you're going through, you have a heritage that can be traced back to the Lord of the universe. This is the crazy love that Francis Chan talks about in that very influential book. Having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God.